Welcome to Asian Book Club, where we highlight Asian and Asian American authors. We are your hosts,
Jamae and Sabangan.
and I'm Stephen Park. And today we bring you read 2 of I'm Laughing Because I'm Crying by Young-mi Mayer. We are continually getting to know more and more about Young-mi. It's a fascinating story that she brings us with a very interesting viewpoint. And I feel like there's a lot of familiarity with things that I've grown up with. One of which is when Youngmi's father embarrasses her. And it's one of those moments where it's so embarrassing that you never want to relive that moment. So you'll do anything to make sure that that moment doesn't happen again. Have you had a moment like this? Especially knowing like your dad is really funny and he tells a lot of funny jokes, but he also has like those waiter jokes.
Definitely those silly dad jokes that feel very specific to the context that dads particularly have.
Yeah, and he's really good at telling them. He has a lot of really good jokes. He knows how to fill in space and stories.
Yeah.
But have you had any moments either with your own father or with your mother or even one of your siblings?
So when I think about a time when my parents embarrassed me, looking back, it was a good thing. But at that time, what I'm thinking about is when my mom made such a ruckus about having tents for the car riders. And I was like, Mom, why are you making such a big deal about this? No one else is doing it. I felt embarrassed because everyone knew it was mom. Mom was the one who made it happen. But looking back, mom was just being very cautious and being caring. She cared about our well being. She cared about our skin. She cared about how overheated the children would be. So I'm not embarrassed anymore, but at the time I felt like it was an embarrassing moment.
So with her focusing on having more tents and things like that available?
Yes, exactly.
For me, it was surrounding a celebration and a birthday to be in particular, and it was my dad. And it was a scenario where, for our birthdays, especially with limited means, it was a very special occasion where we would go out to eat, and whoever's birthday it was got to choose whatever food that they wanted. I feel like I may have told this story on the podcast already, but if you've heard it already, just I guess you're listening to it again. But usually the places that we chose were Korean restaurants or a sushi restaurant or places that were familiar to my parents. And more often than not, these places were run by Korean owners and had Korean wait staff. So when we went, we felt comfortable. We didn't feel like my parents had to speak English. They were very much in the know of how to deal with the wait staff. It's dealing with Korean wait staff is different than dealing with an English wait staff.
For sure.
You usually have people that are older, more mature, people that have been in that business as a service industry person for a long time. But one year I chose Outback Steakhouse as the place I wanted to go to, thinking I wanted to go to a steakhouse as an American boy. This did not turn out well because the wait staff is usually teenagers. I think ours must have been a 20 something, early 20 something female presenting person. And my dad must have learned every technique that he saw on like NBC sitcoms at the time because he tried to make as many jokes as possible.
Oh.
And it was in this like, his English is good, so it wasn't as broken as it could have been. Like, he just had a way of saying it that was extremely embarrassing. And I don't even remember if the food was good. It was probably mediocre. I can't remember anything about the meal besides my dad ordering the meal at that time.
Totally.
And then from then on, thinking, I never, ever want to come to an American restaurant again with my parents as the sole choice for my birthday.
That's fair.
And that never happened again. I feel like for a lot of us, we have those ingrained moments. And I'm certain it's not just a BIPOC or Asian American specific issue. I think parents are going to be parents and they come from a different generation and a different knowledge and a different way of handling things that we wouldn't do that stuff in.
Right. And I think they're thinking about the best for us. Like, regardless of the situation, they're trying to, at least in the experiences that we talked about, they were trying to make a good situation better.
Right. And luckily for us, our experiences weren't traumatizing, whereas Young Mi's experience was a little bit different. It was
Right.
definitely down a completely different route, but that's why you're going to have to wait for the book to come out and read it yourself to figure out what that experience was. And for ways that we can get more books like these, we want to make sure we're supporting those that are coming out with books from AAPI Voices, and that's going to be our recommendation for this week.
Our recommendation for the week is Third State Books. Third State Books is the first independent press solely dedicated to bringing Asian American and Pacific Islander voices, stories, and issues to audiences who cherish them. Their name, Third State, refers to their unique experiences as Asian Americans being a bridge between cultures. You can learn more about Third State Books' work through their website at thirdstatebooks.com and find them on Instagram at Third State Books.
Yep, and that's going to be our recommendation for the week. Okay, so second read of I'm Laughing Because I'm Crying by Young Mayer. We just read pages 51 through 128, which was chapter 4, Children, through chapter 7, Chin, Close Person.
Definitely. And before we get into our discussion, first, just wanting to let everyone know who ends up picking up the book that there are a few trigger warnings in this section. And some of those trigger warnings are murder, abuse, rape, suicide, sexual assault, and eating disorders. So it's a very heavy section.
Yeah, and I don't know if a few trigger warnings would be the way I would put it. I think this book has a lot of depth, but it also goes into a lot of sensitive topics.
For sure.
If you're not in the right mind space to be reading a book that deals with a lot of those topics, you might just want to put this off to the side and give it a later read. Otherwise, you always want to take care of yourself and read it when you're ready.
Yes, absolutely.
So previously, we read a little bit about Young Mi, and this time around, we get to find out a lot more. I think the last read was more on her backstory and where her grandparents and her ancestry came from. This time around, we get to find out a lot more about child Young Mi.
Yes. And one section of child Youngmi's life kind of grew around Christianity because of the school that she went to.
Right. And I feel like that's a popular theme within a lot of Asian cultures, especially Asian American cultures. It's a place where we find our society, it's a place where we find the people that we recognize. But in a lot of cases, it's also where we start to find our rules and how we start to regulate the families and the systems that we end up in.
Exactly. And as a note, we find ourselves in these Christian circumstances because of colonization and what they brought to our specific countries.
Yeah, and it kind of starts off as a sort of a bribe almost to a lot of places that you see Christian colonization. It was bringing money and wealth and showing that to the people of that country that were usually war torn or deprived. And so then you bring people who have all this shiny stuff and food, and you convince them that your religion is going to continue to provide these things.
Right.
And it becomes a way of bribing people into religion, and that sort of shapes what that religion becomes.
Exactly. Like specifically in Philippine culture, or at least the experiences that I've had in Philippine culture with Christianity, the backstory is that when the Spaniards were colonizing the Philippines, the only time that they were given positive reinforcement was when they went to church. But if they didn't go to church, that's when they were punished. And so that kind of bled into Philippine culture in that when you don't go to church, that's when you're punished, quote unquote, by society because they look down on you. They ask you why you didn't go. Where were you? What were you doing? What else is more important than God?
Right. And I think throughout most Christian religions, the theme always comes down to social hierarchy. It comes down to what the Bible says and how we've interpreted it, which we have to remember that the Bible was written and passed on by men over the entirety of the religion. It has never changed, and that seemingly drives the response of how, in certain sections of the Bible, it talks about how women should take care of their man, or how children should obey their parents and their fathers, and everything revolves around that male figure. That is something that Youngmi talks about in terms of how she sees the Christian religion affecting her personal life and her mother especially.
Right, exactly. The whole controlling aspect, like you mentioned, and the whole submission of all of it.
Right. which leads to the next part, which is shame. Because what is religion without shame?
Right.
But a little bit differently, Youngmi talks about shame within Korean culture.
Mm.
And I think this was such an important part because she talks about a very specific word called nunchi.
Mm.
Nunchi is within the society and the gossip of Korea. You'll hear the word nunchi a lot, like 그 사람 눈치 없어, which is like that person has no awareness, or like
Mm.
what are they doing? What's wrong with them?
Right.
In this sense, she talks about very specifically her own father and him not having nunchi and how that affected her upbringing because she had so much shame and she had that Korean weight that she had to carry where all the ancestors put every single bit of shame on her if she stepped even mildly in the wrong direction.
For sure.
And she's living this while her father is wanting the spotlight, like wanting to be seen and noticed, completely different from what most Korean people want to go through.
For sure. And she also mentions how when other Koreans notice a white American in particular do something out of place, they kind of excuse them. They're not very strict about the nunchi with that particular American.
Yeah, and it also then goes into how the people closest to that person or the people that have brought that person to a space have to take on the burden of that shame.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it's something that's very relatable, but it seems more like the concept of it takes a village to raise a child.
Right.
It's that sense of connected culture where if someone does something wrong, we should all be there to act upon it.
Mm.
It's similar to the part where Youngmi was in that situation with that stranger that was possibly going to abduct her,
Yeah.
and the community came around her and supported her, and those girls were there aware and very much waiting to jump in to make sure that the people around were protected.
Yes.
And I feel like that doesn't come without always being aware of the situations, having certain actions that you follow, as strict and as difficult as it may be, and feeling like you're always being watched may not be comfortable,
Mm-hmm.
but it's more just that people are there like family. It's like people watching you inside your own house, not people watching and judging you necessarily.
Gotcha. Do you feel that in the US you feel nunchi?
I do think I feel it when I go to spaces that are Korean.
Gotcha.
And in those spaces, I feel like I have a strong need to be on my very best behavior to show off a little bit of where I came from, and especially not being from Korea,
Mm.
doing my best to represent my parents' decision in coming to America from Korea and standing behind that and showing people that we have succeeded in our journey of what my parents wanted to do.
Totally.
So I think in that sense, like, yeah, I am aware of how other people are looking at me and trying to be on my best behavior and trying to help others and doing all that stuff.
Definitely. When this topic was brought up in the book, I kind of felt like this aha moment. I think societal roles continuously play in the back of my mind. Even though the US doesn't have specific nunchi, there is something inside of me that feels like I need to play by the rules, quote unquote. And it could be my social anxiety, it could be my autism, it could be just anxiety in general. But I feel what you said, how when I went to Korea, there was this certain way of behaving that was expected of us, but not necessarily so. But I felt it. I felt the nunchi. I felt the awareness that everyone else had, and I felt embarrassed on behalf of myself.
Yeah, and it's the reason why you walk on the right side of the road. It's the
Mhm.
reason why elders get more respect. It's an overarching rule book for how people should behave, which I honestly think would benefit a lot of areas in America.
Absolutely.
But speaking of rules, something she talked more towards the end of this read was kind of this rule of the paddle. And what it means is the school principal would walk around with a paddle to try to scare the kids into behaving correctly. So
Mm-hmm.
the paddle was the law, it was what necessitated people to behave correctly.
Mm.
The trick was that the paddle was never used. That law was not what it appeared to be. And there were people that would follow that law, and there were people that lived outside of it and knew what was really going on and could have better understanding of it being at a distance. Now,
Mm-hmm.
my question for you is, are you someone who follows the rule of the paddle, or are you someone that lives beyond the paddle?
I think for a long time I followed the rule of the paddle, but as an adult, I'm beyond that now.
Mm.
What about yourself?
I feel like I have a need to follow the rule of the paddle, maybe because of Nunchi, but I know the corruption in systems. I know that things aren't always as they appear. There's a lot of greed, and I could see that for the companies that I work for. I can see that in places I spend my money. And it's something that I'd want to change,
Mm,
but it's hard for me to change that. Like even filing my taxes, I still don't feel comfortable not using a system like TurboTax or something, even though it's a complete waste of money. But I feel like I need the backing of that company,
for
which
sure.
does nothing for me.
For sure.
I feel like I need to stay within the boundaries of a 40-hour work week and a corporation instead of owning my own business where I can make so much more money. Like, I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's the direction that my parents put me into. So I see what Young Mi's talking about and I agree with her. And it's like someone sat me down and said, there is no punishment. I promise you, you're good if you don't do this. And yet I still need to stay in my seat. I still need to obey and stay quiet and follow the rule of the classroom, even as BS as it may be.
Totally. I totally get that, which is kind of opposite for me. That even though I have social anxiety, when it comes to the government, when it comes to authority, I feel as though I can shake it off now. I feel like I'm an adult. I know, like you mentioned, I know what is beyond the paddle. I know that there's not necessarily a system that's going to watch out for us. So why should I care for it?
Hmm. I wish I could be that way, but I'm not. But it's okay.
Yes.
Let's go into another topic that she talked about, which is chung.
Mm.
Chung is a word that I've discovered recently, even being Korean. It's one of those words that is a part of the culture, and me being outside of the culture makes it so that I learn this through different means.
Mm.
I think I first learned this, and you probably first learned this when we watched that movie Past Lives. It's an A24 film, and it talks about this childhood relationship that grows, and as it grows, the female counterpart in that cis relationship goes out and discovers more about herself and ends up being in a different relationship. But then she goes back and is reconnecting, not necessarily romantically, but reconnecting the relationship with her childhood friend who
Yeah.
was in a sense a lover, and it's a very interesting film, but that film represents what chung is. It represents that connection we have either from a previous life or the current life at a different time. But chung is that emotional familiarity that we can create with someone, and this deeper connection than words or feel or touch can have.
Mm-hmm. When I think of Chong, I think about the friends that I used to have but never kept. And instead, I think about them from time to time and I feel those strings that were attached before as if they're being plucked.
Right. It's a weird thing to describe, but then once you understand it, I think you understand the feeling of that presence.
Mm-hmm.
It's those people that were so briefly in your life sometimes, and yet you're consistently thinking of them as a person. It's not romantic in any means. It's more you're thinking of their spirit and their soul. There is another part about the relationship that she talked about, and this is beyond Chung, but she talks about a Korean style of relationship that I found very interesting because it really described the way that I hold the people near me.
Mm.
And it's amalgamation of being present, but not being verbal or not being overly responsive. It's a being there and consistently being there, showing your love, your support, being present for anything that you might need, and trying to do it even before you understand what you need,
Mm.
but not having to use the words to describe it or even be in the proximity, like being able to do that stuff in the background. And I think that's a lot of how I tend to carry forth with the people that I love.
For sure. You definitely have a way of wanting action rather than words.
Hmm. And trying to do that for the person, even if that person may not notice that that action has happened.
Yeah.
It's a version of the relationships that Young Mi describes within Korean culture. I wasn't sure if it was just me,
Mm.
but I feel like a lot of who I am, the more I'm reading books, and it doesn't necessarily have to be textbooks, but just books about Korean people, I'm finding out more about myself and the fact that I am no longer this standalone individual, which sounds bad, but it's more like I feel like I have a sense of people. Like I feel like I am finally within a crowd of people that understand me
Mm,
rather than a red dot in a white painting.
for sure, for sure.
But one of the other types of relationships that Young Me does go into, though, is relationships with adults.
And this can be with parents, or this could be with aunts and uncles, or parents' friends that we call aunts and uncles. And when she talks about this, she talks about how, with the aunties that she grew up with, they kind of put her down and made her feel like it doesn't matter what accomplishments that she had, they were going to put her down regardless. And that kind of reminded me of my growing up, but in the opposite direction, which is interesting because when I was growing up, a lot of times my aunts and uncles, my parents' family friends would be like, oh, you should be a model, or oh, you should be a basketball player. And it didn't matter if I had really good grades, which is what I excelled in, and it didn't matter that I was this writing extraordinaire. It wasn't enough because I wasn't the things that they wanted me to be.
Mhm. Wait, who told you to be a basketball player?
A lot of the church people wanted me to be a basketball player.
Man, Guam needs better basketball. It's definitely one of those things where even though this story is so specific to Young Me, she's not talking about other people.
Mm-hmm.
She's describing her personal individual life experience. And yet I feel like I continue to reap so much from this book. And it feels like the spirit of what she's trying to say, I'm able to absorb and kind of take it all in and reflect it back onto myself and the
Yeah.
life that I've lived.
Yeah.
How do you feel about the read so far?
The read so far has been so eye opening, like you said, and it's made me feel, even though I'm not Korean, even though I don't have these same experiences that she has, I feel a relatability. And by that relatability, I also feel empathy for her.
Hmm. Yeah, I feel a lot of empathy and sadness for her,
Yeah.
but also weirdly, this book has a sense of joy within every single bit of sadness.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not crying as I'm reading, I'm not depressed as I'm going through this information, but it's such dark news that she delivers in a twist of humor and laughter, which I think is that whole Harry Butthole concept.
Exactly. And in addition to humor, she also uses sarcasm, which delivers it in a way that makes it so that we don't feel burdened, but we feel the impact.
Yeah, I am so excited for the next two reads.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've both talked about this individually that if we weren't doing this podcast, this book would have long been finished.
Yes.
It's so easy to get through, and there's so many connection points within each topic that the fluidity drives us wanting to finish this book.
Mm-hmm.
But our next read is going to be our third read, which are pages 129 through 201, which is chapter 8, Strangers, through chapter 10, Poor.
Definitely. And if you'd like to join the conversation or tell us something that you feel related to with one of our stories, you can email us at asianbookclubpod@gmail.com or join the conversation on Instagram at asianbookclubpod.
Yep, and we also have our website, which is asianbookclubpod.com, that has our bookstore for books that we've read in the past, books that we recommend, and books that we plan to read in the future.
And a great way to support us is to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast.
Otherwise, make sure to be happy, be healthy, and read a book.
Ingat.
Bye.
Bye.